Dad leaned toward my bedroom door that morning, his hands still greasy from the workshop. He held out his credit card and a small piece of paper with the PIN written on it in block capitals. "Vanessa, could you order that Bova watch for me tonight? I had a problem with the website. Just pay for it here." I nodded, starting to tie my boots for work, and placed the card on my desk next to the piece of paper. It had been a long day at the port. Delayed containers, an unresolved customs call, and a supervisor who didn't tolerate mistakes. When I got home to Bixby Knolls, my eyes were aching. All I wanted was a shower and a nap, but then I remembered the watch. I turned on my computer, entered the details, and pressed submit. The screen lit up red. Transaction declined. Insufficient funds. I frowned. Dad wasn't careless, and this card was for important purchases. I tried again. Same message. Confused, I checked my balance. What I saw wasn't a few $100s for a watch, but rather a mountain of bills at high-end boutiques on Pine Street, a confirmed airline reservation, and a non-refundable beachfront booking. The floor creaked, and Sienna strode in, waving a glittering bag as if she'd just stepped off a runway show. Her jeans gleamed under the lamp, and new cards dangled from her blouse. She tossed her hair and smiled wryly. "You're in 2-0, and tomorrow I'm going to Huntington." I needed a break. My jaw dropped. But the absurdity of it all hit me first. She'd actually done it. She'd lifted the card, read the PIN, and spent thousands of dollars as if money grew on jacaranda trees outside against my will. I burst out laughing. Not polite laughter, but laughter of disbelief. Sienna's wry smile vanished. "What's so funny?" she snapped, shifting the bag to her other arm. Before I could reply, Dad's footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door swung open, his face flushed with embarrassment, his jaw clenched, and the walls shook at his voice. "Who stole $20,000? Sienna froze, her complexion fading as quickly as it had glowed. The purse slipped from her grasp, and tissues scattered across the carpet. In that frozen moment, I knew the old balance in our home had crumbled, and there would be no easy way back to the way things had been. The morning after Dad's outburst, I left the house before anyone else woke up. The port was bustling, cranes towering into the sky like iron trees, engines roaring across the yard. I walked between rows of containers, keyboard in hand, checking seals and listening to the clatter of radios. My job was routine but steady. The kind of work that teaches patience. Goods didn't move faster just because you wanted them to. They moved when the circumstances, the paperwork, and the schedules aligned. I saved every extra dollar. Sometimes I'd skip lunch and put the money into an account I rarely used. Every deposit was a building block in a plan I kept to myself. A plan to run my small consulting business and help shipping companies that lacked the patience to deal with delays and codes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was my world. Sienna lived in a different world. She called it freedom. Nights in downtown Long Beach, cocktails under neon lights, mornings when she didn't wake up until after sunrise. Her social media feeds were full of smiles, friends surrounding her, and comments about living in the moment. At home, she told stories of parties and spontaneous encounters with people who understood her perfectly. My parents would laugh along, their eyes shining with pride. Sienna lit up the place. My dad once said it was like magic was a coin. My mom always added, "She'll find her way." She always does. I never heard the same thing said about me. My updates about a shipment clearing customs, or a new process I'd streamlined, were met only with polite nods. Nothing more. Hard work, it seemed. It didn't shine in the same way. I told myself I didn't care. That discipline was more important than applause. But every time Sienna enjoyed their admiration while I was out of sight, something inside me tightened. Resentment was like a gentle wave, tugging at the edges of what I thought I could bear. When the reality of the stolen card settled into the silence of our home, I knew that wave was finally beginning to tip, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded on all of us. The credit card theft didn't come out of nowhere. It was just the biggest wave in a wave that had been building for years. I could trace it back to small things. Bills I'd set aside on my bedside table, neatly folded 20-pound notes that would disappear the next morning. At first, I thought I'd miscounted or spent it without remembering, but the pattern repeated itself. Each disappearance coincided with the days Sienna was dazzling in new jewelry or out on nights out. When I confronted her once, she tilted her head with that smile that always disarmed our parents. "Relax, I own it. I only borrowed it. You're getting too worked up." She promised she'd pay me back, and sometimes she did, slipping a $5 bill into my hand later, as if that evened the score. I convinced myself it wasn't worth fighting over. My mother played the mediator, reminding me we were sisters, and that money came and went. "Don't count the points," she'd say, as if fairness were trivial. My father was difficult to understand. He appreciated work, but he rarely reprimanded Sienna. When she charmed him with a story or gave him a hug after a night out, the problem would fade away. I kept my anger to myself, as if it were forbidden, invisible to everyone else. The anger came first, but guilt always followed. Perhaps I was too rigid, too serious, too unwilling to let things slide. Sienna's lightheartedness made me seem heavy-handed by comparison. Part of me wondered if it was my fault. If I smiled more, joked more, would they see me differently? The card changed that. It wasn't just a lost bill or a flimsy excuse anymore. It was thousands of dollars being spent on designer clothes, plane tickets, and a vacation I hadn't been invited to. It was proof that a string of small losses had led us straight to the brink of something we could no longer get past. As I saw Dad's face harden and Mom's voice tremble, I knew the reckoning was finally due. That night, I sat at my desk with the card still lying where Dad had left it, the scrap of paper beside it like an indictment. The events of the morning flashed through my mind. Dad had leaned over, asked me to buy the watch, then dropped them both in plain sight. I'd rushed out, convincing myself that it could wait until evening. I didn't give it a second thought when Sienna poked her head out of my room later, claiming she needed my charger. She lingered longer than usual, her eyes darting rapidly toward the desk before finally leaving. The evidence was now crystal clear. Flight confirmations, hotel reservations, and shop purchases, all paid for with that card. A non-refundable deposit at a beach resort in Huntington. 2 plane tickets in Sienna's name, booked for the following morning. My heart raced as I scrolled through the details. This wasn't just a handful of bills or a few drinks bought with borrowed money. This was fraud perpetrated with Dad's trust as collateral. I could almost hear her justifying herself for forgetting the card and writing down the PIN. It was an open invitation. This was Sienna's logic, twisting reality to suit her. But invitations don't excuse theft, and negligence doesn't excuse betrayal. What bothered me most wasn't just the money, but how easily it had been done. No hesitation, no fear, just the certainty that she would get away with it. She had invaded my personal space, taken what wasn't hers, and built a fantasy weekend on someone else's earnings. I sat in the chair, staring at the dwindling balance on the screen. My father had entrusted me with his account, and I had left the door open. Sienna walked in without a second thought. When her laughter echoed through the hallway later, I realized that the confrontation ahead wouldn't be just about money. It would be about every excuse, every act of overlooking things, every time we had turned a blind eye. Now we had no choice but to look her in the eye. The hallway felt narrower than usual, the walls closing in on us as my father's voice shook the room. Sienna stood there, her shopping bag still half open, her eyes darting between us like a trapped animal searching for a way out. "You spent it," my father boomed, his hand clutching the printed statement. $20,000. You think I've worked all these years so you could flaunt designer clothes and book vacations? Sienna lifted her chin, her old weapon of confidence flashing for a moment. "It wasn't like that," she said quickly. "I just left the card. The pen was written on it. How could I be the only one at fault when she'd invited trouble?" Her words weighed heavily, but not as heavily as they might have once. My father looked at me, waiting for my answer. My hands trembled as I handed him the printed receipts, each one stamped with a time. "I was at the port all day," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Each receipt corresponds to the number of hours I was there. And they're all in her name. Airline tickets, hotel deposits, luxury store purchases. There's no doubt who made them." Sienna's smile faded. "You're twisting the story. I didn't know it was Dad's card. I thought it was yours. I figured you wouldn't mind after all you've accumulated." My father's features hardened at this. He looked at me, then at her, and something in his expression changed. For years he had scoffed at her stories and dismissed my quiet complaints, but now the weight of the paper and numbers was heavy in his hands. It was undeniable. My mother emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands with a towel, a look of confusion on her face. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes scanning both of us. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. My father handed her the receipts, and she read them silently, her lips pursed. For the first time, the easy excuses didn't come. Sienna tried again, this time in a gentler tone. "Dad, it was just a mistake. I'll return it to you." But no one moved to protect her. A tense atmosphere hung over the hallway, as if the ground had shifted beneath our feet. In that silence, I realized that the reckoning had just begun. The house remained tense for 2 days. The silence was broken only by short commands and the closing of doors. My father barely spoke at dinner, his eyes fixed on his plate. My mother moved cautiously between us, as if one wrong word could ignite another explosion. Sienna avoided me completely, isolating herself in her room as if the hallway itself had become hostile territory. On the third night, my father invited us into the living room. He stood before the fireplace, a folded credit card statement in his hand. His voice was calm now. No shouting, no raging, just absolute certainty. "I'm not going to sue," he began. "But this isn't going to disappear. You stole $20,000. Say it, honey. You're going to pay it back." Sienna crossed her arms, her anger rising. "How do you think I have that kind of money?" "You're going to work," he said. "Every paycheck, every tip, every bonus, whatever you earn, will go straight into paying off this debt until it's gone." Her laugh was short and sharp. Are you serious? Yes, my father replied. And to make sure there are no excuses, Vanessa will help draft the agreement. It will be signed, notarized, and it will be clear. No more arguing. All eyes turned to me. I swallowed hard but nodded. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing a repayment plan that divided the debt into monthly installments. It wasn't going to be quick. It would take years, but it was a must. When I handed him the papers, he read every line, then pushed them across the table toward Sienna. She glanced at them, her jaw clenched. This is ridiculous, she muttered. You're treating me like a criminal, Dad replied. You've treated us like fools. Now you're going to make it right. For a long moment, I thought she might refuse. Then, with a sharp breath, she snatched the pen from the counter and wrote her name at the bottom. The signature stretched across the page, dark and uneven, but it was there. Dad folded the papers and put them in an envelope, sealing it like a safe. The atmosphere in the room changed. The verdict had been delivered, not in a court of law, but in our living room, and the slow process of paying off the debt had just begun. Sienna got a job at a commercial warehouse, the kind of place where shifts are 12 hours long and the air is thick with the smell of dust and oil. On her first day, Dad drove her home and stood by her until she walked through the metal doors. For the first time, he didn't smile or wave. He waited until she disappeared inside the car, then silently turned the key. For the first week, she came home with sore hands and a sullen face. She would bang her shoes against the wall and mutter about supervisors yelling orders and coworkers treating her like she was nothing. By the second week, she started arriving late, or so she claimed, even though everyone knew the bus ran on time. At night, I could hear her pacing her room. I could hear the clatter of hangers as she pulled clothes out of her closet. Soon after, pieces of her new wardrobe began to disappear. I passed a second-hand clothing store on Anaheim Street one afternoon and saw a blouse displayed in the window, its tags still attached. She was getting rid of what had once been her treasures. Each sale was enough to cover her gas or groceries, with the rest going straight into the envelope to pay off Dad's debts. Her social life had faded just as quickly. Her friends, who had once flooded her phone with invitations, fell silent. Photos of packed bars and late-night laughter vanished from her feed. When I passed her room, I sometimes saw her scrolling through old photos. Her face was illuminated by a screen that no longer reflected the life she had constructed for appearances. My mother, who had always been so quick to soften the blow, no longer rushed to her defense. She just cooked, cleaned, and carried on with her life. But when Sienna complained about the injustice, my mother would simply purse her lips. It was as if her supply of excuses had finally run dry as she watched my sister shrink under the weight of her choices. I felt something mixed, half relief, half pity. She had been impenetrable for so long, that golden girl, the light everywhere. Now the glitter had faded, leaving only the stark reality she could no longer conceal. It had happened on a Tuesday. Sienna came in before noon, her shoulders slumped, a folded letter in her hand. She didn't have to say it. Silence hung over her like the dust settling on the warehouse floor. Her father read the page, his eyes narrowing as he read the words. Dismissal for repeated lateness, failure to follow instructions, and poor performance. He placed the letter on the table without a word. For a long time, only the ticking of the clock above the refrigerator could be heard. Then he said, quietly but firmly, "Your chances are over. You must find a new job immediately or leave this house." Sienna opened her mouth, ready to reply, but her mother cut her off, not with words of comfort, but with a quiet, trembling nod. "Your father is right," she said sarcastically. "We can't keep pretending things aren't the way they are." The room seemed to tilt. For years, Sienna's mother had been her shield, concealing her mistakes and turning them into harmless excuses. Hearing her mother's support for her father made Sienna blink, as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. I spoke cautiously, not wanting to add to her vulnerability. There were administrative assistant positions available at the port. Not a glamorous job, but stable. And I knew a woman in Wilmington who rented out shared rooms cheaply if she needed somewhere closer to work. She glared at me. "You'll fire me too," I said. "I'm not firing you, but I'm not paying your bills." "You need a plan, not another excuse," she said, and put the letter back in her bag, muttering something unintelligible. My father didn't get up, didn't shout, just sat there with his arms crossed, waiting for her to choose. The barrier was stark and cold, and for the first time, no one in the family rushed to break it down. The night before she left, Sienna moved quietly around the house, gathering what she could fit in a small handbag. No speeches, no dramatic pronouncements, just the soft click of drawers closing and the rustle of zippers being pulled away. I sat at the kitchen table, listening to every sound as it echoed through the walls. As dawn broke, Dad drove us all downtown. Greyhound Station smelled of exhaust and old coffee. Sienna stood near the platform, clutching her bag, her eyes fixed on the bus, which was parked with its doors open. For the first time, she looked small, her sparkle gone. None of us spoke. Relief and sadness mingled thick in the silence. Part of me wanted to hug her, but the memory of every stolen bill, every sneer smile when she ignored my anger, held me tight. Still does. Dad's jaw was clenched, unyielding. It was Mom who finally broke the silence. Her voice was low. It meant more to her than it did to us. I should have seen that sooner. I kept making excuses, always saying she'd get over it. I thought loving her meant protecting her. But maybe I was making things worse. Sienna turned then, her eyes darting quickly to my mother, then to me, then to my father. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but she just nodded slightly and went upstairs. The sound of the doors closing filled the station, followed by the roar of the engine starting up. We stood there watching until the bus was just a gray line merging into the traffic. No one moved, as if they were leaving space for what had just passed between us. The air felt both lighter and heavier. And in that strange equilibrium, I knew that life inside our house would never be the same again. Weeks passed, and the house settled into a rhythm I'd never known before. Meals became calmer, but not strained, just regular, like the tides flowing ceaselessly. My father came home from the store every evening, and would even stay at the table asking me about my day. One night, after I told him about a successful shipment I'd arranged, he put down his fork and said, "You never let me down." Ian, I should have said that sooner. The words weighed more heavily than I'd anticipated, and for a long time, I couldn't respond. My mother had changed, too. Instead of going around in circles of conflict, she'd started volunteering at a small financial education clinic near Signal Hill, teaching families how to protect themselves from fraud and debt. When she came home with pamphlets, her eyes had a new look. "I want to make sure no one else lets love blind them to the truth," she told me, almost to herself. As for me, I'd finally signed my first client for the consulting firm I'd been planning for years. It wasn't a glamorous company, just a medium-sized freight forwarder, frustrated by customs delays, but it was mine. I rented. In the corner of my modest office in Signal Hill, with windows overlooking distant cranes, I felt a kind of ownership I'd never known before. The repayment agreement still sits in my desk drawer at home, Sienna's signature engraved at the bottom. I kept it not as a weapon or a reminder of her failure, but because it proved to me something I had learned the hard way. Boundaries are not acts of revenge, but rather firm anchors against storms. And with this firm anchor, I was finally able to set sail for a different kind of harbor.
अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं ये जो दिन सहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा बेसर्द लगता है दिल का हर एक कोना अब बहुत ही दूर भरता है अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं ये जो दिन सुहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा सर्द लगता है दिल का हर एक कोना बहुत ही दर्द भरता है मेरे साए भी मुझसे अब जुदा होने को कहते हैं तुझे खोने की राहों में ये आंसू बहने लगते हैं कहाँ जाऊं कहाँ ढूंढूं मेरा वो साजो सामा तो मेरी हर एक तमन्ना तू मेरी रूह का मका तू लकीरों में नहीं लिखा जो तुमने ख्वाब देखा था वफा की इस कहानी में फकत एक गम ही लिखा था सितारों से भी पूछता है पता तेरा कहाँ होगा मगर खामोश है दुनिया कहाँ मेरा जहाँ होगा बस एक बार मुड़ के देख ले आज भी तेरी वफा की सख्त जरूरत। साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर। साए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर, दर्द का असर।